Welcome to Calm Historian, where we'll gently explore a clear list of capital punishment methods, where they appeared, why they were adopted, and how attitudes changed over time. Please comment your location and your current local time before we begin. If this thoughtful history resonates, please consider liking and subscribing. Throughout the long arc of human history, the final act of a condemned life has worn many faces. If you trace that arc with your hand, you feel a procession of instruments and rituals, some crude, some engineered with cold precision, each one shaped by the needs, beliefs, and anxieties of the society that bore it. This is not a catalog of cruelty for cruelty's sake, nor a parade of lurid detail. It is a human story of law and order, of shame and retribution, of fear and spectacle, told through the means by which communities have severed one life from the body politic. In the earliest chapters, punishment was braided into the rhythms of communal life. Stones were gathered and hands clenched, and the compulsion to enforce social norms was given a blunt, immediate voice. Stoning was simple and public, a congregation forming the boundaries of justice, a ritual born of communal judgment. Death by exposure, leaving a body to the elements or to scavengers, and ritual drowning tied punishment to the contours of landscape, riverbanks, deserts, cliffs. These methods cast the condemned back into nature, as if the community could unmake what it viewed as corrosive by returning it to the raw world. Verticality across civilizations became a ready metaphor for shame and surrender. Impalement and crucifixion turned bodies into signs on the horizon, displayed for travelers and traders as warnings. Crucifixion in particular stretched punishment into hours and days, a slow public commentary on crime and authority. The wheel shattered and displayed, making the body into grotesque heraldry whose spokes were a visible lesson about the costs of transgression. Such punishment spoke as much through visibility as through violence, meant to instruct entire populations by turning flesh into a warning. Blades carried a different language. Cutting off a head or wielding a sword or axe could be both ceremony and a condemnation. Beheading could be swift. It could take place in the hush of aristocratic ritual or under the public gaze. The idea of a clean death, a single decisive stroke, mirrored social hierarchies in which rank shaped not only fate, but its manner. The gallows, by contrast, often expressed a different moral ordering. Hanging, once a simple and functional technique, became ritualized into a communal event, scaffold and rope, the collective intake of breath. It was a moment for the town to gather and mark the border between acceptable and forbidden. At times, punishment and performance braided tightly together. Public executions were civic theater, staged to be seen from the market square, walking the line between deterrence and spectacle. Officials and priests interpreted the ritual while the public filled the benches. Bodies were not merely removed, they were made into lessons. Courts and crowds sometimes demanded elaborate demonstrations. The condemned might be drawn and quartered, their limbs displayed at crossroads to admonish travelers. Torture, too, not always but often, was woven into adjudication, pain itself becoming a kind of law's punctuation. Then, in the late 18th century, mechanical ingenuity reshaped how societies thought about death. As revolution and Enlightenment ideas spread, there was a push for methods seen as more humane, more rational, less capricious. A device engineered to sever the head with efficiency came to symbolize that transition. A machine intended to reduce suffering while standardizing the act of death, enacted in an era when nations debated the balance between justice and mercy. Around that same turn, the culture of spectacle began to fray. Executions were increasingly questioned, their theatrical quality judged barbaric in light of new ideas about dignity. The 19th and 20th centuries intensified the relationship between technology and punishment. An electrified age produced an execution conducted through the power lines, a jolt meant to end life by scientific means. In other moments, chambers were sealed and gas introduced, a system that converted death into experiment and clinical process. The machine age tried to remove the humanity, and with it, the unpredictability, from the executioner's work. Yet those innovations raised new moral questions. Could a state distance itself from violence by turning it into a mechanical procedure? Did precision absolve responsibility, or merely disguise a human act beneath stainless steel and protocols? War and ideology left their marks too. Firing squads, bound to military codes and notions of honor among soldiers, enforced discipline where courts-martial found guilt. Totalitarian systems and the machinery of genocide repurposed logistics of killing on an industrial scale, weaponizing method to achieve political ends. The 20th century's darkest chapters showed how techniques of execution could be transformed into tools of systematic extermination, how method could serve ideology with chilling efficiency. As the century wore on, legal and ethical currents shifted again. Many nations began to re-examine capital punishment's place in the modern state. Debates about deterrence, justice, and the possibility of error drove reforms. Executions moved from crowded squares to enclosed spaces. Public performance was traded for private protocol. Some countries abolished the death penalty entirely, while others retained it but limited its use. Newer methods framed as more humane alternatives to the violence of the past appeared in this context, not answers that silence debate, but installments in an ongoing conversation about how societies reckon with the gravest of punishments. Through all these changes, one constant persists: the weight of consequence. Whether a sentence was carried out in silence or amid cheering, by blade or by chamber, the act of state-sanctioned killing has always been a mirror held up to a society's values. It reflects fears of crime, of disorder, of what might be allowed to flourish if left unchecked. And it bears witness to hopes, sometimes aspirational, that law can restore balance. The instruments themselves, the rope and the blade, the chair and the needle, are only part of the story. More revealing is how communities have placed those instruments into ritual, the speechifying of officials, the stoic faces of relatives, the hush before the final act. These moments reveal how law and theater, mercy and vengeance, ceremony and cruelty intertwine. To speak of methods of capital punishment is not merely to enumerate tools. It is to trace how human beings have tried to reconcile the demands of justice with the limits of mercy, how they have sought order through the most irreversible of measures. Each method carries with it a context, a legal code, a theology, a technological moment, an economy of shame. To hear this history aloud is to hear centuries of debate and dread, the low murmur of courts and the roar of crowds, the steadying hand of officials, and the trembling of those who stand before judgment. It is a story of institutions as much as of individuals, of communities shaping a world in which some lives are adjudged forfeit, and of the uneasy, persistent question that follows. How should a civilization end one of its own? They sit at the top of the page like 4 small signposts: talk, read, edit, view history. At first glance, they look like simple labels, quiet and plain at the edge of a screen. Look closer, though, and they become doorways, thin handles that invite you into a much larger conversation. Each one offers a different way to stand among the people who came here before you, and a different way to leave something behind. Talk is the murmur just beyond the printed lines, the soft hum of voices that never quite reach the street. It promises argument and consolation both. Questions asked in the small hours, the slow choreography of disagreement, the gentle correction you'd offer a friend, and the stubborn insistence of someone who has thought a thing through. This is where the living pulse of the page gathers. Private anxieties and small triumphs, people wrestling over what to say and what to keep quiet. Sparks sometimes flare, but more often you find many hands carefully weaving until they discover a thread everyone can follow. Read is the room you enter first, where the assembled work sits like a long table under warm light. Words arrive in a steady, familiar rhythm. paragraphs pruned and replanted, sentences shaped to be as clear as glass, so a traveler from any background can set their cup on the table and understand? Reading is an act of trust and reception. For a little while, the labor of others becomes yours. Around that table, a chorus forms, some contributors known, some anonymous. People who have tried, above all, to make the world a little more navigable by placing facts and feeling with care. Edit is an invitation to shape what you see, a pair of gloves waiting on the arm of a chair. It is the simplest and bravest of the four, a small command that hands you the responsibility to change the thing you are reading. To click it is to accept that responsibility, to correct a typo, refine a sentence, add a forgotten detail, or remove a line that no longer fits. Editing holds the hush of craft and the spark of possibility. It is hands in the clay, the choice to risk the imperfect human touch in the hope of improvement. That single syllable opens the space where mistakes are mended and new ideas begin to move. View history as a quiet staircase spiraling down into the past. Click it, and you do not just see a list of changes. You feel the page as a living chronology, layered with small human gestures, edits that blush with apology, versions that stand like weathered stones, reversions like the backward step of someone who changed their mind. Here the page keeps its memory, a ledger of its own becoming. Every edit is a mark in the margin of time, a footprint in a long corridor walked by editors with different priorities, tones, and moods. To view history is to breathe in that long trail and to realize that what you hold on your screen is the product of 1,000 tiny decisions, each still there to be read and understood. Taken together, these 4 words form a small map of communal knowledge. They remind you that any single sentence is rarely the work of one mind. It is the result of many hands in conversation across time. There is gentleness and rigor here, impatience and patience. There is the thrill of discovery and the sober work of correction. You can stand at the threshold and simply read what others have built, step into the conversation to argue or console, reach forward to reshape a single line, or step back to study the whole unfolding story of how the page came to be. They are modest words, plain and repeated on screens around the world, but each carries the possibility of encounter, the chance to learn, to be changed, and to change something for the better. When you move your cursor toward them, you choose how you will participate in this quiet, vast workshop of minds, whether to listen, to speak, to build, or to remember. I don't yet have the historical fragment to expand. The message you sent only contains appearance hide text. I can't invent facts, so please paste the original historical text you want. Expanded, including any dates, names, and events you want preserved. If helpful, tell me. Preferred tone, graceful, dramatic, warm, restrained, etc. Target length, about 2x, 3x, or up to 5x of the original. Voice for the voiceover, first person or third person. Once you paste the fragment, I'll transform it into a fluid, audiobook-ready narrative that keeps every fact exactly as given. I can also show a short example of the style before expanding, if you'd like. I don't see the historical text you want me to rewrite. Could you paste the expanded version here? Also confirm a few quick points so I can match your expectations. Narrator tone. Do you want a neutral literary voice, default, or something like warm, mournful, or epic? Male or female narrator preference? Any phrases, names, dates, or details that must be preserved exactly? You said about the same length as the original. Is that correct? Or did you want the Safeev X expansion mentioned earlier? Once you paste the text and confirm those choices, I'll turn it into a coherent, fluid, engaging voiceover script, keeping all facts and details unchanged. I only received the single word width as the fragment. Did you mean for me to take that one word and unfold it into an immersive 5 times longer narration? Or did a longer historical fragment get cut off when you pasted? If you intended the single word, I can shape it into a vivid voiceover that explores the idea of width, its physical, historical, and human echoes, without inventing specific events. If you meant to provide a different passage, paste the full fragment and I'll expand it exactly as you requested. If you want me to proceed from that single seed, imagine this. Width is not merely a measurement on a ruler, but a kind of breath. It opens like a window, a slow widening of attention that lets in landscape and possibility. Think of plains running unbroken to the horizon, the sudden widening of a river as it finds the sea, the cloth stretched across a table where hands gather and stories are told. Width names the space that allows two strangers to pass without touching, and the space that lets two ideas sit side by side and change one another. Width measures more than distance. It measures capacity. It is the room in a heart for another person, the span of an idea that refuses to be hemmed in, the margin where an artist steps back to see the whole canvas. In the hush before dawn, when shadows hold their breath, width is the promise that there is more than one path, more than one shore. Horizons, once seen, reshape how we stand and how we move. To speak of width is to speak of invitation, of doors opened, of fields widened, of a life that makes room. Tell me which you prefer, a longer layered meditation like this, or the original historical fragment if it exists. If you want the full expansion, I'll continue in this tone and length to give you a complete voice-over-ready piece. The fragment is almost painfully simple. 2 marks on a page, the single word wide. And below it, color with the faint parenthesis, beta, tucked beside it like a whisper. Yet simplicity can be a kind of doorway. Hold those 2 words up to the light, and you begin to see more than letters. You begin to see a life of possibilities. Picture the paper itself. A narrow strip, edges softened by handling, fibers catching the light like the grain in an old plank of wood. The ink has settled into those fibers, darker where the pen pressed with purpose, paler where a fingertip might have grazed a letter and smudged it just so. The W of wide rises and falls with a hand that knew exactly how much weight to give a letter, how much breath to leave between one stroke and the next. That single syllable opens like a gate. Wide, not narrow, not contained, but expansive. An invitation to look beyond the margins. Below it, color swivels in a different mood. The C curls as if in contemplation. The O loops like an eye that wants to drink in sight. Then, in parentheses, beta, a small technical note, a stage marker, the language of testing and becoming. The parentheses hug it protectively, as if to say, this is provisional, experimental, not yet fixed. The contrast between the bold openness of wide and the tentative hum of color, beta, reads like a quiet conversation across the page. Vastness and trial, seeing and testing. Listen to how those words sound aloud. Wide, an exhale broad enough to relax a shoulder. Color, a word that contains vision, taste, mood. It hums with sensual possibility. Beta, a soft, clipped word from another register, the language of drafts and work in progress. Together they form a tiny drama. The world is wide, but we're still testing how to render its color. You can almost imagine the person who set them down, not to invent their life, but to feel the gesture, a pause, a careful placement, the decision to jot a prompt rather than a full sentence. Maybe they were sketching an idea, making a working label, or leaving themselves a note for a later canvas. The handwriting speaks of someone who cared about nuance, wide in scope, careful in method. There's a physical rhythm here, a musicality you could play with in the voice. The long vowel in wide stretches like a horizon. Color, with its 2 syllables, dips and rises. Beta, smaller and enclosed, acts like a metronome keeping time. A narrator could shape each delivery. Slow and spacious for wide, bright and exploratory for color, intimate and tentative for the parenthetical beta. The words set a cadence, an emotional architecture that moves from open air into the workshop of thinking. That is the true charm of this little fragment. It resists being pinned to a single meaning, yet it insists on meaningfulness. It holds a tension between the grand and the provisional, between the sweep of a view and the humble tools we use to describe it. To sit with these two words is to remember how creation often begins, with a vast impulse and the small, patient notations that try to translate it. So as you listen, let your mind widen in time with that first word. Let color, all the hues, shadows, and reflected lights of whatever scene you imagine, step forward on an experimental palette. Keep in your ear the soft caveat of beta. Every attempt at rendering the world is a test, a draft, a step towards something fuller. In those two terse marks, a whole process breathes, the desire to capture expanses, the care to leave things unfinished, and the quiet human hope that what we try, even provisionally, might one day bloom into clarity. Automatic. Light arrives before words and after silence, slipping through the shutters of a sleeping room like a quiet messenger. It presses against the eyelids and asks gently whether the world will be noticed today. It carries a smell, not its own perhaps, but of the things it wakes: cold stone warmed into dust, the steam from a bowl of porridge, ink drying on a page. It moves like an old friend across the floor, tracing the worn grooves of a threshold, sliding along the curve of a cheek, catching on the threadbare embroidery of a shawl until small, forgotten details become suddenly visible and meaningful. Light has a temperament. Sometimes it is brittle and sharp, cutting the landscape into high contrast and revealing edges and shadows that could almost be taken for language. Other times it pours like honey, softening hard lines and lending every object the mercy of a kindly painter. It can be impatient, the flare of noon that leaves nothing to guess, or conspiratorial, a slant at dusk that suggests secrets folded beneath a table. It can make a room honest, or make it lie beautifully. In how it favors a face or a corner, it decides what to reveal and what to withhold, shaping our histories by what it chooses to illumine. There are mornings when light arrives through dust motes, a slow, patient army that marches across the air in single-file specks. Each one holds a tiny private world, a spider's lace quivering, a child's lost marble catching a flash, the ghost of last night's hearth smoke. In that drifting glow, the ordinary becomes a constellation, and time, for a moment, holds its breath. Hands that begin the day learn to read its subtleties. What shadows promise dampness, what sudden glints warn of a polished blade. Eyes tuned over years decode the language of brightness. The angle of a window names the season. The color of the sky forecasts weather. The way light hugs a person tells you who they are before they speak. At dusk, light becomes a memory maker. It lengthens and leans, taking the day's stories and pressing them into the edges of things, so that every surface seems to hold a history. Street lamps, low and patient, fold small circles of glow around conversations and footsteps. In kitchens, the flame of an oil lamp pools where cups are set down. In workshops, light rests on the curve of a lathe and honors the patient hands that turn wood into bowls and beams into houses. Lovers learn the private geometry of their rooms by the fading light. Elders keep the past alive in the warm pockets where sunset lingers. Light is also a kind of mirror for the soul. It shows where people are open and where they hide. A face lit by earnest intent seems to open like a book. A face lit from beneath will drape itself in shadow and keep its margins secret. To follow light is to follow intention. It tells you where attention lies, where labor has been spent, what has been celebrated and what has been mourned. And all the while, light is indifferent and absolute, a faithful interpreter of the world's contours. It makes paths visible, calls travelers out of the dark, and returns the names to things left anonymous overnight. Wherever people gather, around fires, at dawn markets, under the thin blue of early morning, they orient themselves by its shape and timbre. It is the first language before speech, the small mercy that arranges chaos into a scene you can stand inside and remember. Dark. Those two words feel like a label pinned to the edge of a heavy book, a list of methods of capital punishment, a quiet heading that barely prepares you for what follows. Open the ledger and the first thing you notice is the weight, the smell of old paper, the thicker strokes where memory presses hardest, names and methods piled like footprints across generations. The pages are full of decisions that ended lives, each entry an act of law and an echo of a time when a society decided someone must die. But the list is more than technique. Every method recorded carries a context, a legal code, a faith, a custom, the architecture of a courtroom, or the layout of a public square. These are not dry instructions, but scenes, judges striking gavels, executioners following their orders, the tremor in a condemned voice, the rustle of skirts and coats in a crowd that has come to watch. Language itself moves across the pages, sometimes blunt, sometimes euphemistic, sometimes bureaucratic. The words chosen can soften the deed or refuse to hide it. Across continents and centuries, people devised different answers to the same grim question: how should a life be ended when law demands it? Some answers were meant to be swift, clinical gestures that closed the book quickly. Others were ritual and slow, designed to be felt and remembered. Some punishments were meant to teach, performed in full view, a lesson carved into public consciousness. Others were intended to be private, discreet acts carried out away from prying eyes. Each choice reveals something about what a society values or fears. The ledger sits where law, religion, custom, and fear meet. It maps shifts in collective thinking, moments when cruelty gave way to restraint, times when mercy retreated before retribution. New methods were added, old ones fell away. Arguments were renewed about what counts as humane, even within the act of punishment. Every entry suggests a larger debate about rights and responsibilities, and about how far the state may go when it claims ownership over life and death. Turn the pages and the human dimension comes into view. The officials who must carry out sentences, the lawyers who plead for mercy, the families who stand at the margins and watch their world unravel. You can hear the hush of a courtroom, feel the wind sweeping across an open square, notice the gossip that flutters through a crowd like loose paper. There are those who protest, those who watch in reluctant awe, and those who simply record the event for history's ledger. None of these scenes are abstractions. They are lives intersecting with the machinery of punishment. The ledger is also a mirror held up to us. Reading the list forces questions. How do we define justice? What balance do we strike between deterrence and dignity? How do we remember those taken by state-sanctioned force? Speaking these names aloud becomes an act of witnessing. It is a reminder that behind the spare headings lie faces, families, and consequences that ripple outward for generations. So let the names on that list be more than entries on a page. Let them become a chorus, voices threaded through time, asking what a society gains and what it sacrifices when it takes a life in the name of law. The ledger offers no tidy answers, only the heavy weight of history and an invitation to listen, to remember, and to reckon. The page opens with a single line that lands like an unadorned headline: current methods. These methods of capital punishment are currently legal in at least one country. It reads like a catalog entry, blunt and bureaucratic, as if someone were listing tools instead of speaking of human lives. But behind that clinical sentence, there is a wide, shifting landscape of law and loss, of statutes inked in different capitals, and the small, trembling details of individual stories. Picture the map it suggests. Not a single territory, but a patchwork of places, each stitched with its own history and habit of judgment. In some patches, the law still specifies certain means of taking a life. In others, those instruments have been put away, statutes revised. The last pages of legal codes turn. The line doesn't name the countries, and it doesn't need to. Its power comes from what it evokes, sanctioned endings somewhere, and the heavy machinery of law that makes them possible. Think of the rooms and the rituals that orbit such laws. There are courtrooms where gavel and argument decide who will face the state's most irreversible act. There are prison corridors that smell faintly of disinfectant and institutional coffee, where guards trade terse updates and families wait on chairs too small for their grief. There are sterile chambers, apparatuses shrouded until the moment they are revealed, protocols read aloud by officials in uniforms that try to make the terrible feel procedural. And then there are the people whose lives intersect this sentence. The condemned, sometimes defiant, sometimes resigned, sometimes haunted by memories of a life once whole. The families who cling to last rites or a single remembered laugh. The lawyers who move through the slow, meticulous machinery of appeals, filing papers, and staying up late over case law. The executioners, ordinary hands carrying the weight of a law they did not write. Each of these moments is a small human drama set against the backdrop of a statute that grants finality. The sentence also traces time itself, laws passed, amended, upheld, overturned, a slow drift as societies wrestle with justice, deterrence, retribution, and mercy. It reminds us that legality is not the same as unanimous conscience. What is lawful in one place may be abhorred in another. The terse record makes no moral judgment. It simply notes a fact. In at least one jurisdiction, certain methods remain on the books. Read aloud. Those words demand more than a dry reading. They ask us to imagine the rooms and the conversations, the long nights spent with legal briefs and worn prayer beads, the way a statute can throw a long shadow over small human things. They push us to listen for the hush in waiting rooms, to hear the echo of footsteps in tiled halls, to feel, for a brief moment, the full gravity wrapped into that simple declaration. What begins as a line on a page becomes, if we look, a tangle of human lives and institutional orders, a map of practices and a chorus of private voices. The sentence holds them all together, an official, economical record that nevertheless opens onto the messy, intimate reality behind every legal notation. There is a single heavy certainty that has marked the rituals of state punishment for centuries: the rope. Hanging is one of the two most common methods of capital execution still used around the world, and in places that keep the death penalty, it often unfolds with grim precision. In many systems, the mechanics are measured and technical, a calculated drop designed by law and by experience to break the neck, a sudden fracture that severs the fragile link between body and waking mind and brings about an almost instantaneous loss of consciousness. The aim, clinical and cold, is to spare the condemned a long, visible struggle and to make the final moment brief. The instruments are disarmingly simple: a scaffold or gallows, a loop of rope, a catch that drops away at the appointed second. Yet the atmosphere that gathers around them can be very different. In some courts and prisons, the preparations are ritualized, the length of the drop worked out on paper and marked on the platform. The rope is inspected and the knot placed with a surgeon's care. In others, the procedure depends more on custom than calculation. Still, the same human sounds and gestures haunt every execution. Footsteps on wood, guards shifting in their uniforms, a crowd holding its breath. Those small noises that measure the moments before the final move. Hanging is used today across a wide and varied landscape: Afghanistan, the Bahamas, Bangladesh, Botswana, Egypt, the Gaza Strip, India, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Japan, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Liberia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Oman, Pakistan, St. Kitts and Nevis, Singapore, South Sudan, Sudan, and Syria. In each of these places, the method carries its own layers of law, history, and public feeling. Sometimes it is a matter of state protocol, carried out with bureaucratic exactness. Sometimes it is a subject of protest and private grief. The names on the list read like a map of diverse cultures and political systems. But at the center of each scene sits the same instrument: rope, a measured drop, and a judge's final order. Not every hanging aims to break the neck. Take Iran, where the short drop method is still in use. The staging there is more elemental: a stool, a rope, a stand. The condemned stands on the stool. A hand withdraws the support, sometimes snatched away in a single motion, sometimes eased out slowly, and the body falls only a short distance. That brief fall is not enough to fracture the cervical vertebrae. It does not grant the instant loss of consciousness that a long drop attempts. Instead, the body is left to the slow, brutal mechanics of strangulation. Breath is choked off. Death can be measured in gasps, in the tightening of muscles, in the long stretch of minutes that follow. It is a different kind of ending, more prolonged, disturbingly intimate in its suffering, and it leaves a heavy echo in the memory of those who witness it. Across continents, whether by the abrupt snap of a designed drop or the lingering constriction of a short fall, hanging remains an execution of contrasts, methodical and unbearably human at once. The rope itself is simple, twisted fibers worn smooth by handling, yet its consequences are final. Taught between 2 points, it becomes a narrow line that separates a courtroom's verdict from the silence that follows, a last stark measure between law and what comes after. The gun has been one of the world's most commonly used instruments of execution. Sudden, elemental, brutal in its simplicity. In many places, the sentence takes the form of a single, precise discharge. The hush of a small room, the cramped geometry of a prison cell or courtyard, the quick, final report of a firearm. That solitary shot is often aimed at the back of the head or at the heart, and has been the closing note in countries as varied as Afghanistan, Belarus, Burma, China, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Taiwan, Yemen, and before the moratorium, Russia. Those names summon mountain passes and desert tracks, crowded cities and isolated outposts, but the mechanics of the moment are unnervingly similar. A life can also end under a very different sound, the staccato rattle of automatic weapons. Where conflict or mass punishment required speed and control, authorities have sometimes employed volleys. A machine-gunned execution is not private, it is an event. Thailand, for example, carried out executions by machine gun as part of its ritual of state violence before moving toward lethal injection. Picture a gun-belted squad, the ripples of recoil, the percussion rolling across a parade ground or a clearing. A single bullet seeks quiet efficiency. A volley announces overwhelming power, leaving a public, physical impression you feel in your bones. Between those extremes stands the firing squad, an arrangement with its own ceremonial precision and grim gravity. It has been used in parts of the United States, in Bahrain, in Cuba, in Nigeria, in North Korea, in Indonesia, in Oman, in Somalia, in Somaliland, in Tajikistan before the 2004 moratorium, in Qatar, in Uganda, and in the United Arab Emirates. The scene is half bureaucratic, half theatrical. Men in uniform, a line of rifles, the way sunlight or lamplight catches on polished metal. Sometimes the condemned wears a hood, sometimes not. Sometimes the execution is staged as a warning. Sometimes it is carried out behind closed gates as a procedural formality. Small details, the scrape of a boot, the twitch of muscle, the flash of metal, make the moment unbearably human and ritualized at once. Despite their outward differences, these methods share a stark clarity. They are direct, immediate, irreversible. The places that have used them tell a history of law and power and the choices societies make about violence. Whether in a silent cell where a single shot ends a life, in the thunder of automatic fire, or in the rigid order of a squad of marksmen, the human reality is the same. One life concluded by the machinery of state authority, leaving behind families, communities, and the long, complicated debate over justice and cruelty. The sound that remains is never just the report of a gun, it is the echo in the lives left behind. In the winter of 1982, a new ritual entered the grim lexicon of capital punishment in the United States: lethal injection. Imagine a room stripped of ceremony, its walls cool and unadorned, a single bright light falling on a table where procedure met finality. The air held the rehearsed quiet of officials and witnesses, a hush heavy with both dread and a strange clinical calm. There was no spectacle, no angry crowd, only the careful choreography of people trying to make an ending look tidy. That first use was a turning point in how states sought to end a life. It moved executions away from the loud mechanics of older methods and toward an image of medical precision, a sterile efficiency that softened the edges of public horror without answering the deeper questions at its heart. The scene, its light, its silence, its instruments, traveled beyond courtroom doors. It became language for debates in legal briefs and diplomatic halls, and an anxious image in the minds of governments considering their own paths. In the decades that followed, that method left its country of origin and appeared on distant shores. Nations as different in geography and culture as China, Guatemala, the Maldives, Nigeria, Taiwan, Thailand, and Vietnam added lethal injection to their systems of punishment. Each adoption carried its own backstory: political pressures, legal reasoning, debates about modernity and humanity. Yet the common thread was clear: a desire to recast a violent act as a controlled procedure. Those choices did not resolve the moral knots they touched. To frame execution in terms of procedure and control was to ask whether form could make finality more acceptable. The world map quietly filled with chambers that looked antiseptic from a distance, while up close they remained sites of intense controversy and sorrow. What began in one American room in 1982 became, over decades and across continents, a shared chapter in the modern history of punishment, an answer that changed the face of execution without making its questions any simpler. There is a particular hush that falls over certain rooms, not the kind that comes from emptiness, but the kind that holds the memory of force waiting to be used. That hush has a name: electrocution. It is a narrow, stark chapter in the long, difficult story of how societies take a life by law. The idea of a wire, a current, an appointed chair became, in the hands of the state, a precise instrument of finality. Picture the chair itself, a simple frame of wood and metal under bright clinical lights. Leather straps and bolt holes pick up a cold glare. Imagine that object placed in different rooms across different lands. A windowless chamber in an American penitentiary, a concrete cell in a tropical correctional facility, linked by the same humming possibility. Across oceans and legal systems, the technique was never adopted widely. In practice, only two nations came to use it in any real measure: the United States and the Philippines. That narrow geography gives the method a peculiar weight. It is not a global habit, but a regional practice, rich with cultural echoes and haunted by particular histories. Because it was concentrated in such specific places, the chair carries more than machinery. It carries meaning. It became an emblem of state power at the moment when law, science, and punishment tried to meet. The wire and the current were more than technology. They were the chosen language of finality, wrapped in the rituals of courts and the solemnity of procedure. In rooms where the decision was carried out, the hush deepened, a silence that held both technical certainty and a terrible human suspense. Today, electrocution's place in American law is small and particular. Only one state still names it as the primary means to carry out a death sentence: South Carolina. There, when appeals have run their course and the machinery of courts, juries, and punishment reaches its terminus, the chair remains the default instrument. Elsewhere, the chair has retreated from center stage, but it has not disappeared entirely. A handful of states preserve it as a legal option, a backstop to be called on under certain conditions. Those states, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, keep electrocution on the books as a secondary pathway. Think of those names together, and you see a map of retained possibility. Places where the law still allows an alternate route, even if it is rarely, if ever, chosen. Behind those dry lists are real people, legislatures debating, judges weighing appeals, families waiting in rooms that never lose their tension. Wherever the chair still figures in statute, it arrives laden with history and the hush of moments yet to come. It is a somber emblem, remembered and reserved in a handful of states, and in the memory of just 2 nations. There are moments when a single decision hangs in the air like a held breath, a hush that ripples far beyond one room and takes its shape in law, in policy, in the names of states on an inked page. In 2024, the United States crossed such a threshold. Nitrogen hypoxia, cold and clinical in name, was used for the first time. That single act, performed under the stark lights and solemn procedures that surround the country's most final penalties, carried with it an unmistakable gravity. It was a moment both quiet and seismic, an introduction of a new option into an old, fraught system. From that point, the choice began to echo through state capitals across a swath of the South. One by one, places where courts and legislatures continually balance history and law place that same option into their statutes, not as the primary course, but as a backup, a secondary method to be called upon if others were unavailable. Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Oklahoma each added nitrogen hypoxia to their lists, a technical, sober annotation in legal code that nonetheless speaks to larger debates about technology, authority, and the ways a society chooses to mark its limits. Imagine the arc from a single, unprecedented application to its quiet adoption elsewhere. A procedure first used in 2024 that then becomes a written possibility in the governance of 5 states. The facts are simple, almost clinical on the page, but the scene that unfolds around them is anything but. In hallways lined with portraits and in the echoing spaces of legislative chambers, officials debated language and precedent, while the public watched and argued in living rooms and online forums, in courtrooms and legislative halls, in the corridors where policy is debated, and in the quiet rooms where families reckon with consequence. This development has left a trace, an expansion of options, a new chapter written into the tangle of law and morality. It is a change both technical and profoundly human, its contours shaped by statute, but felt in the pauses and whispered decisions that follow. There is a room people speak of in low voices, a small, sealed chamber whose very existence carries a weight of silence and history. Picture a narrow space lit by a single overhead bulb, the hum of building systems in the walls, and the deliberate, almost ritual choreography of officials moving with the grim efficiency that comes from carrying out the state's darkest responsibility. You can imagine the metal click of doors, the faint scent of cold concrete, the way every footstep seems louder under that solitary light. It is a place designed to remove life quietly, mechanically, without spectacle, and in that design it has become, over time, an object of dread and fascination. This particular method, the gas chamber, has a strange and lonely pedigree. In the record of modern justice, it has been used only in 2 places, the United States and Lithuania. Those 2 names stand apart on the ledger, a small and eerie pair, each with its own stories and controversies wrapped around the technology and the people who implemented it. For decades, the chamber was part of the apparatus of capital punishment, a clinical option among others for ending a condemned life. It carried with it all the contradictions of law and morality, the attempt to make execution orderly, the hope that procedure could somehow hide the violence at its heart. Time has narrowed the chamber's role. Today it exists mainly as a fallback, a measure kept in reserve. Arizona, California, Missouri, and Wyoming listed in law as a secondary method. to be used only when the primary option is unavailable or impracticable. That legal afterlife gives the chamber a peculiar status. Not the first choice, not a centerpiece of policy, but an admitted possibility, sitting quietly in statutes and sometimes in concrete rooms. It is a reminder that the machinery of state power retains more than one way to carry out its most final decisions. To stand before the idea of the gas chamber is to confront a concentrated portion of human story. The law's attempt to control death, the technicians and officials who maintain the systems, the families who come seeking closure, and those who arrive to contest the morality of it. There is a hush that falls over a building when people move through the slow business of endings. The paperwork, the rehearsed movements, the waiting. Though the chamber's use has dwindled to a legal footnote in a few places, its presence still shapes debates about punishment, dignity, and the limits of authority. In that way, the room is both literal and symbolic, a sealed place in which the state's capacity to end a life can still be exercised, and a quiet, forbidding testament to a practice that has been narrowed but not entirely erased. For as long as people have written laws and handed down punishments, the sharp edge has been one of the instruments chosen when a community wanted finality. Decapitation returns again and again in those choices. In palace courtyards and on village greens, in the hush of dawn outside a prison and beneath the jeer of a scaffold crowd. It has been adopted at different times and in many places, a grim constant whenever rulers or judges sought a penalty both swift and irrevocable. Picture a gallery of scenes rather than a single image. Solemn magistrates reading sentences, the slow preparations of ritual and mechanism, the nervous hush of relatives and onlookers, the metallic glint of instruments catching the sun. Some executions were staged to terrify and to teach. Others were wrapped in the forms of legal procedure, meant to make the act appear inevitable and orderly. The human responses remained much the same: fear, grief, anger, and that intrusive curiosity that draws strangers to witness the end of a life. Among the many devices humanity devised, one came to stand out in the popular mind as the symbol of decapitation, the guillotine. It is unmistakable in description. A tall frame, a guided blade held aloft, the sudden release that turns calculation into irrevocable consequence. There is something stark in its geometry, a cold choreography where timing and mechanism replace muscle and chance. When the blade falls, its precision transforms an ancient, brutal act into a mechanical certainty, and that image lodged the guillotine deep in the imagination of later generations. Yet despite its long presence in human practice, decapitation has receded from the legal mainstream in most of the world. What once appeared in many legal codes and cultural repertoires has become, in contemporary state practice, an exceptional occurrence. Within the factual frame that governs this story, the practice survives in a single national context. Today it is used only in Saudi Arabia, and there the act is carried out with a sword. Imagine that contemporary scene with the restraint of a witness. The execution is prepared according to formalities. The air feels taut with the knowledge of what is coming. The blade here is more ancient in appearance than the clinical guillotine, a sword that flashes cold and terrible in human hands. There is ceremony and there is silence. Every sound seems to shrink around the moment to emphasize it. Around that moment stand the familiar figures, the condemned, whose life narrows to the space between an inhale and an outcome. The officials performing their roles with practiced motions, the relatives carrying a grief that will not easily be spoken, the bystanders, each carrying a private reckoning with justice and mortality. Perhaps a cloth is smoothed, a footfalls fall away, a whispered prayer is cut short. Small, human details that give the scene its unbearable weight. This is a story of continuity and change. The arc from scattered practices across times and places to a focused, modern instance in a single country traces how societies evolve in what they will tolerate and what they will abandon. Through it all runs an unflinching fact. An act that severs life at its most literal edge has always carried a human drama. The weight of law, the sharpness of a blade, the hush after the fall, and those elements, told patiently, remain part of our shared history. They bring the stones like an inevitable tide, rough and ordinary rocks held in hands that have become instruments. A crowd closes in. The air hangs thick with dust and a peculiar hush, as if sound itself might break something fragile. At the center stands, or kneels, a single human figure suddenly diminished by the weight of a community's judgment. The first stone is thrown, a dull thump against flesh, an almost ordinary sound that in a heartbeat becomes final. Others follow, measured or frantic, a stuttering rain of blows that the body was never meant to take. Each impact throws up grit and the metallic tang of panic. Breath comes in short, shocked gasps. Wounds deepen with every cast until whatever life clung to the body is finally extinguished. This is stoning, a collective act in which a group pelts a person with stones until the injuries prove fatal. It is not only violence, but a public punishment carried out in full view of a gathering that blesses, condemns, or simply witnesses. The scene holds a knot of human voices and silences, the hands that throw with a grim resolve, the onlookers whose faces are hard to read, the murmurs or cries that ripple through the crowd. The mechanics are brutal and simple, ordinary objects turned into instruments of finality, ordinary people made participants in an extraordinary cruelty. In the modern world, this ancient practice has not entirely vanished. It is enshrined in law in certain places: Afghanistan, Brunei, Iran, Mauritania, northern Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Yemen. Each name a reminder that stoning survives within contemporary legal systems. When it ends, the crowd disperses, and what remains is dust and a terrible memory. The imprint of a communal act that erased a life and left behind only silence and the faint, persistent scent of grit. There was a time when punishment was meant to be seen and felt by everyone who could be gathered into a square or squeezed into a narrow street. The instruments and rituals of death were arranged with theatrical care, a stage set for terror where suffering was not only inflicted but displayed. The aim was never merely to end a life, it was to remold the living through a public lesson. Spectacle and pain were braided together into a single message, a calculated humiliation that stripped a person of dignity in front of an audience. People came with curiosity, with fear, and with a grim appetite for confirmation that the world's order was intact. Officials and faith leaders performed their parts while executioners, sometimes masked, moved with practiced efficiency. The air often tasted of smoke and iron. The hush that fell at key moments was as much a part of the performance as the cries and the clatter. Instruments were chosen not only to kill, but to prolong and intensify, each act measured to communicate cruelty and to dehumanize the condemned. The point was not only retribution, but intimidation, an attempt to make possible crimes seem too costly even to imagine. For those who watched, and for the families who watched beside them, such displays left marks that lingered long after the square was swept clean. They taught obedience through fear, normalized brutality, and carved deep lines of trauma into communities. Children who grew up with these scenes learned to equate order with violence. Whole neighborhoods learned caution where there might once have been trust. The ritual of public punishment became a language of power, spoken in pain and understood in silence. Though laws and morals have shifted, those old impulses have not entirely vanished. In some corners of the modern world, groups that operate outside any state's law have revived the logic of spectacle, using terror, humiliation, and filmed violence to intimidate, recruit, or punish. The shadow of those earlier methods still falls across the present, a reminder that the theater of cruelty, once a common public ritual, can echo again in the violent acts we see today. Across ages and across borders, one grim truth repeats itself. people have sometimes turned the power and ferocity of animals into a means of punishment and spectacle. The image is simple and terrible, a living force pressed into the service of judgment, and it takes many terrible shapes. What unites them is the will to make death not only final, but public, theatrical, and weighted with meaning. Imagine first the elephant, towering and implacable, its foot like an anvil. An elephant could be guided to serve as an instrument of crushing. In the hush before the blow, the air seems to hold its breath. Then, when the weight comes down, it settles with the finality of a falling boulder. There is a cold awe in that slow, remorseless certainty. A massive creature taught to deliver a human sentence, and witnesses could hardly look away from the terrible inevitability of it. Then picture the arena, the roar of a gathered crowd, the bright sun, and the crack of whip and voice. There is the old phrase damnatio ad bestias, the cliché of being thrown to the lions, which evokes a ritual of humiliation and terror where men and animals met in close, chaotic combat. But it was not only lions that fed the spectacle. Alligators and crocodiles lurked with armored hides. Piranhas waded in dark water. Scorpions perched like cruel punctuation. Sharks cut through surf, and venomous snakes lay coiled, ready. Each creature brought its own kind of menace. The flash of teeth, the sudden strike, the quiet, patient poison. And each change in animal altered the mood of the event while keeping the same brutal purpose. A different cruelty used draft animals in a mechanical, agonizing way. In medieval Europe and in imperial China, the condemned could be bound and attached to horses, often four, and then pulled apart until the body was torn asunder. The word quartering evokes that image plainly. Literature such as the Song of Roland even holds the tearing apart as a stark emblem of violence. In parts of the Middle East, a comparable variant used camels in place of horses, relying on the patient, stoic strength of these animals to enact the same dreadful principle. Beasts yoked to a fate and a body pulled to pieces. There were also punishments that did not stretch a body but crushed it beneath weight. Trampling by horses leaves a different kind of memory, not the calculated wrench of quartering, but the downward press and pounding of hooves that flattens and pulverizes. A striking historical example is the fate of Al-Mustasim, the last Abbasid caliph in Baghdad, whose end is often cited to illustrate this terrifying mode of execution. The image is immediate and brutal: hooves, mud, and the slow obliteration of a human form beneath animal mass. Rome, with its taste for ritual, devised a particularly claustrophobic method, poena culae. The condemned were placed into a sack, a private world of darkness and panic, and sometimes a number of animals were put in with them before the bundle was cast into a river or the sea. It combined the suffocation of confinement, the added terror of close quarters with creatures, and the final, indifferent swallowing of a body of water. The scene is savage in its particulars: the rustle of hide, the gurgle of water, the last muffled struggles. Listen to these images in sequence, and you hear variations on a single human theme: the mingling of power and fear, of ritual and cruelty, the ways societies have sometimes made spectacle of death and enlisted nature's own ferocity as executioner. Each method leaves its own impression: the slow press of an elephant's foot, the snapping jaws and stinging tails in an arena, the wrenching misery of horses pulling to pieces, the heavy trampling of hooves, the sealed dark of a sack drifting underwater, and each impression presses on the senses in a different register of horror. Taken together, these practices compose a somber chorus of how violence has been ordered and displayed through history. They remind us that spectacle can be a means of control, that animals, in their strength, their teeth, their silence, have been turned into instruments of human judgment, and that across time the staging of death has often been intended not only to punish a body, but to send a message to everyone who watches. Breath is the most ordinary of things until it is taken away. Across centuries and cultures, the quiet theft of air has been one of the cruelest ends bestowed on the living, intimate, invisible, and final. It can arrive without violence, a hush that closes in, a world reduced to a single urgent task, drawing one more breath. Sometimes that theft comes as ash. Imagine a flurry of gray drifting into a room, soft as snow and heavier than hope. The tiny particles fall and settle in corners and crevices, coat lips and lashes, and grit the mouth. In that hush, sound grows distant. The lungs fill with a powder that refuses to leave. People choke on the silence as much as on the ash, hands clawing at the air that will not answer, until lightness vanishes and the world narrows to the labored ache of lost breath. Other times, the air betrays us in a way we can't see. Picture a hearth burning steadily in the heart of a home, coal glowing like an embered eye. When the house becomes a cage, that steady warmth can turn sinister. The smoke that should have fled through chimneys lingers like an invisible guest, a colorless, deceptive presence that slips into the blood without a cry. Families and captives who once sat by these fires, thinking only of warmth and light, can feel comfort harden into danger as the room blurs and voices dull, taken not by flame but by a silence that creeps from the inside out. Sometimes the removal of breath was deliberate, a punishment wrapped in law and ritual. In ancient Rome, Vestal virgins judged to have broken their sacred vows faced a fate meant to be both symbolic and final. They were consigned to the dark underworld of the city, sealed beneath the very stones they once walked upon. Buried alive, their end was designed as a slow, solitary severing from daylight and society. A ritualized erasure that left the noises of the living far above and unreachable. As instruments and customs changed, so did the hands that ended breath. There were places where the final act was public and personal, a hands-on silence performed before witnesses. The garrote, once the executioner's tool in Spain and in territories under its rule such as the Philippines, cramped breath into a violent, sharp moment. Elsewhere, the rope did not always fall to break the neck. In more recent times, certain executions in Iran have used a short drop hanging, a method that finishes life by strangulation rather than by a single decisive fracture. Across these images, ash settling like dust, unseen gases seeping into blood, sealed earth pressing down, a cord drawn tight. One theme remains. The most ordinary, vital function of all can be turned into the most intimate instrument of death. The settings change and the stories differ, but each ending shares that same hush. Everything becomes suddenly irrelevant once breath can no longer answer. They had a clinical name for it, and an even starker purpose: to take a life without letting the earth drink it. On the wide, windswept steppe, where herds moved like living tides, people believed the ground itself deserved a kind of purity. To spill blood openly was to stain that plain. To avoid it was, in the harsh logic of the place, to carry out punishment cleanly and without further desecration. Among the many grim inventions of law and war, there was therefore a way of killing that spared the soil, and spared the onlookers the sight of gore. They called it backbreaking. It was not a sudden, theatrical snapping so much as a slow, inexorable denial of life. Before the act, the condemned might be treated with a rough dignity, bound, brought out beneath a coal-colored sky, allowed a last look at the horizon where herds grazed and tents stitched the land. The execution itself made no claim to mercy. It was a deliberate application of force intended to end a body without spilling blood on the open ground. Muscles and bone were overwhelmed, breath faltered, and the earth remained dry beneath them, untouched by the violence enacted above it. The image haunts the record because one of the great figures of that era probably met his end this way. Jamuka, once among the highest of the Mongol elite, a man whose fortunes were tied to the forging of an empire, is thought to have been executed by backbreaking in 1206. Picture him then, a leader stripped of command, brought before the same wide sky under which he had rallied men and horses. Whether his death was quick or prolonged, what survives in the telling is the grim intent behind it. To remove a life while leaving the steppe unbloodied, as if to keep the land unmarked for the future it would still have to hold. Beyond the names and the politics, the practice itself reveals something about a people living close to the earth, about taboos and necessities, about the ways a community orders violence when it must. It is a small, terrible detail of a larger history that helps us see, vividly and sorrowfully, how lives were ended and what rules governed even that final, uncompromising act. They lashed him to the mouth of a cannon as if fastening a curse to iron. The rope bit into his wrists and shoulders, the cold black barrel pressed against his chest like the end of the world. Around them, the air tasted of salt and dust and something metallic. The quick, acrid tang of gunpowder that hangs over a field whenever men mean business with death. A handful of soldiers moved with a hard, efficient choreography, the kind learned by hands that have done this before. A powder charge shoved home, a match or a fuse readied, muscles steady even when the work itself is brutal. There was a last, useless moment in which the condemned might lift his head and look at the sky or at the faces gathered to watch, as if any upward glance could turn the course of what was coming. The crowd around them held a charged hush. Faces showed different reasons for being there. Some came with hatred, some with raw curiosity, some with a thin hope that violence would settle in urgent fear. Above them, the authorities arranged the scene like stagehands, making the punishment both spectacle and lesson. A demonstration meant to terrify as well as to kill, a way to show that law, or conquest, could break bodies and break will. When the fuse burned down, the cannon answered, and the world contracted into a single, terrible sound. It was a thunderclap that shook the ground and sent a plume of smoke and heat outward. Cloth and hair trembled against people's skin. Dust rose and fell again like a slow, gray tide. For an instant, everything the eye could recognize was lost to that force. When the smoke thinned, the exact shape of what had been was gone, swallowed by the blast and the noise. What followed was a silence so heavy it could be felt, the kind that presses on a crowd after the most absolute of acts. The method left no doubt, quick, noisy, and final. Beyond the immediate violence, there was a crueler calculation. To deny ordinary rights and comforts, to steal a body from the hands of kin, was to turn execution into a warning that could not be softened by mourning. Across history, when rulers wanted an example to last, they sometimes chose the mouth of a cannon for its speed and its spectacle, and left behind a hush that spoke as loudly as the blast. Imagine a knife drawn along the exposed column of the back, cold steel tracing the ridge of bone as if mapping out some terrible heraldry. The skin is opened beside the spine, cut carefully and cleanly, and hands, steady or trembling, whether in duty or rage, work to peel flesh away so that the ribs can be pried outward. With deliberate force, the bones are broken and spread like the struts of a savage fan, carved and stained so that they read at once as gore and as wings. Through those rents in the back, organs are tugged free, lungs pulled outward and held like blood-dark banners until they hang, awkward and unmistakable, from the wound. That is the image at the heart of the phrase blood eagle, a sculpted mutilation that leaves the victim's torso opened and the ribs flared, an image of wings painted with the victim's own life. The surviving descriptions are spare and brutal, carried down in medieval Norse sources and amplified in later retellings that mix outrage with a kind of grim awe. For centuries, storytellers, poets, and scholars have argued over what those lines actually mean, whether they record a literal form of execution performed by Viking hands, a theatrical exaggeration meant to terrify enemies, or a poetic metaphor that later listeners turned into grisly detail. The sources themselves offer room for all of those readings. The possibility of a practiced ritual exists in the old texts, and so does room for doubt. Historians continue to debate not only whether such a deed was performed at all, but how often it might have happened, and whether it was even practical in the way the stories describe. Each interpretation says something different about the people who told the tales and the audiences who wanted to hear them. Whatever its origin, the image endures, an unforgettable final spectacle in which a human body is made into a message, anatomy arranged into language, and brutality transmuted into symbol. It forces us to look at the mechanics of violence, the blade, the broken ribs, the exposed lungs, and at the way cultures remember, amplify, and sometimes mythologize the cruelties of their past. They brought out the great iron cauldron as one brings out an instrument already heavy with meaning, black and bowed, its belly scarred from 100 fires. It sat over a roaring pyre, held on chains or a tripod, a dark mouth waiting. Even before the work began, the pot had a presence, a weight of history and intent that cooled the air like a shadow. The work of boiling was simple in its mechanics and terrible in its intent. The pot was filled, the heat coaxed up, and the chosen liquid was driven until it seethed and roared. Sometimes it was water, suddenly bitter with steam and ash. Sometimes it was oil, thick and gleaming, bubbling like a hellish broth that clung to everything it touched. Tar and tallow smoldered and spat in dark, viscous clouds. Molten lead, when used, hissed with metallic fury, a bright, lethal torrent when it found flesh. Each medium behaved its own cruel way, and every choice mattered. There was an economy to the preparations. Wood stacked in hungry tiers, bellows stretched and readied. The cauldron hung at the precise height to coax the right heat. As the fire took hold, the surface changed. A first tremble, a steady chorus of bubbles, then the violent roar when the whole mass boiled. Curtains of steam rose to sting the eyes and wrap the place in a shuddering fog. Smells layered over one another, the greasy sweet of fat, the acrid bite of smoke, the almost chemical tang of molten metal, and the sounds were never mere background. The crack of flame, the constant hiss of scalding, the low moan of the gathered crowd. For those forced to the cauldron, it was a confrontation with elements made monstrous. Water seared and scalded, oil clung and intensified the burning, tar and tallow smothered and frothed, and lead, when poured, struck like a bright, unyielding wave that seared instantly. None of them offered mercy. The act was decisive and mechanically simple, and everything about it, the heat, the smell, the sound, left impressions that lingered long after the embers cooled. To the witnesses, whether appointed to watch, to judge, or to stand trembling at the edges, the scene was both ritual and warning. It was a demonstration of power that turned plain materials into instruments of finality. There was a grim choreography, hauling ropes, stoking fires, the slow approach to the boiling rim. With every stage, the air tightened, voices hushed, and the world narrowed to the sound of the cauldron and the steam that rose to hide what had been done. The breaking wheel was never an abstract idea of justice. It was a thing of wood and iron that lived in the town square, a blunt, deliberate poem of pain laid out for all to read. Imagine a great cartwheel set on its side, spokes stretching out like the ribs of some sleeping beast. Limbs were spread along those spokes, joints exposed and vulnerable, the wheel serving as scaffold and instrument at once. When an offender was brought forward, the punishment was meant to be seen, a slow, mechanical undoing of the human shape that turned the town into a theater of warning. The device's appearance carried its own language of threat. Strapped to a plank or bound directly to the wheel, the condemned would be arranged so the executioner could strike in a prescribed order. An iron cudgel or bar met flesh and bone in deliberate strokes, aimed to shatter limbs and scatter strength until only the torso and head remained as reluctant bastions of life. In some customs, the broken body was then threaded through the wheel and hoisted on a pole, exposed to the road and the sky, a message of law that could not be missed by travelers or neighbors passing by. This instrument of punishment took on another life through a name, the Catherine Wheel. That name reached into Christian memory and attached itself to St. Catherine of Alexandria, a figure of late antique devotion whose story shaped medieval imaginations. According to pious accounts, Catherine was a young woman of learning and resolute faith who confronted the philosophers and authorities of her day and refused to renounce her belief. For that refusal, she was condemned to the wheel. The legend surrounds the moment with a drama almost crafted to become emblem. When Catherine approached the appointed device, the very wheel prepared to dismember her failed. It broke, or was shattered by what many regarded as a miraculous intervention. A crowd that had come to witness punishment instead witnessed what they took for a sign. The tale goes on to say that Catherine was then beheaded, a final and terrible closure to a martyr's testimony. Pain turned into sanctity on the same spot. Artists painted her with the ruined wheel at her feet. Churches kept her name in liturgy, and the image settled into devotional memory. That image of the wheel traveled far beyond altars and court squares. It lodged in paintings, pageants, and the spoken word as a double witness to cruelty and to constancy. The Catherine Wheel became both a brutal instrument by which bodies were disciplined and a broken emblem of steadfastness when attached to the saint's tail. Over centuries, the wheel threaded through popular culture as a reminder that implements of justice carry stories as heavy as their iron. To hear this story aloud is to feel its textures, the rasp of rope against wood, the hard thud of the executioner's blow, the hush that falls when a crowd measures a life in strokes. It is a history of terrible specificity and public theater, where technology and belief, spectacle and sanctity meet at a single turning wheel. The name Catherine Wheel holds those strands together, the crude geometry of punishment and the fragile, luminous legend of a woman whose fate, in tradition, changed what that cruel instrument could mean. There are punishments whose memory sits like a bruise on history, not just for what they did to bodies, but for how they were watched and remembered. Burning at the stake is one of those punishments, a slow, terrible ritual that came to mark the condemnation of heretics and alleged witches. Picture the pyre built on a town square or a windswept hillside, a heap of timber waiting to be lit, the air taut with unease. Men and women press forward in the crowd. Some have come for justice, others to satisfy a grim curiosity. When the flames begin to lick the kindling, the crackle of wood blends with muffled prayers and shouted accusations. In moments like that, fire is not only heat or light. It becomes a public language of shame and removal, a way for a community to mark someone as outside its care. Not all fires were the same. Across continents and cultures, the methods of burning varied, and sometimes cruelty took on a deliberate, intimate slowness. Chroniclers tell of certain Native American captors who applied single pieces of burning wood to a captive's body, prolonging suffering until life slipped away. There's a terrible closeness to that kind of violence, up close, measured, each ember a deliberate act, each moment stretched until time itself felt like another instrument of punishment. These accounts remind us that execution was not always a quick instrument of statecraft. At times, it was a staged exercise in domination, a performance in which every small detail of torment was calculated to humiliate and to crush. Another image that haunts our imagination is molten metal poured over a human being. Stories speak of warm, shining metal funneled down throats or poured over heads, an almost ceremonial reversal where the gleam of wealth becomes the instrument of destruction. Folklore linked this fate to specific crimes. Counterfeiters, it was said, might be punished by having molten metal poured down their necks. Traitors, by having it poured over their heads. Legends fastened themselves to famous names to make the horror feel personal and memorable. Some accounts even attach this fate to Marcus Licinius Crassus, the Roman of vast fortune, and to Pavlo Pavliuk, the Cossack leader. The very phrase molten metal summons the metallic hiss, the flash of brightness, the sudden irreversible burn that transforms flesh into something unrecognizable. Yet these particulars are often wrapped in rumor and retelling. We must say cautiously that such deaths were supposedly carried out this way, aware that history sometimes borrows imagination to make its cruelties easier to grasp. Then there is the brazen bull, a cruel contraption imagined as an iron beast. According to the tale, a victim would be sealed inside a sculpted bull while a fire burned underneath, turning the metal chamber into an oven. Storytellers describe how human cries were twisted into a hideous mimicry of an animal's bellow as the metal warmed, sounds muffled, and then extinguished. The historicity of the brazen bull is debated. Some details likely grew in the telling, but the image endures because it captures something raw about theatricalized cruelty, the desire not only to kill, but to transform a person into a symbol, to turn their final moments into spectacle. Whether by pyre, by the deliberate placing of burning wood, by molten metal, or by an iron beast, these methods leave the same residue on memory, a cold recognition that human ingenuity can be turned toward torture. The stories themselves, repeated and reshaped through generations, become part of the punishment, a cycle in which cruelty is both acted and remembered, and in which the telling keeps the bruise alive. Crushing, the slow, implacable silencing of a body beneath weight, can arrive like a sudden mechanical death or like an unbearable lengthening ordeal. Picture wood and iron forming a crude frame, a man pinned face up while stone after stone is laid upon his chest. Feel the pressure gather until every breath becomes a labor and sound slips away into memory. There is something intimate in that violence. Ribs and lungs and will force to yield beneath an indifferent mass, the body folding under physics and purpose. One of the best-known victims of this punishment was Giles Corey, an elderly New Englander caught in the terrible sweep of the Salem witch trials in the autumn of 1692. When he refused to enter a plea to the accusation, the law offered a grim answer, peine forte et dure, literally strong and hard. They laid him on his back, propped a plank above him, and piled stones upon that plank to compel a reply he would not give. He is said to have endured the burden without yielding, mindful that a plea would bring consequences for his property and his family. For 2 long days the weight increased, each added stone like a question, and his silence like stubborn defiance. Contemporary accounts and later retellings linger on small, terrible details. The crunch of timber under force, the groans that slipped out between breaths, the eyes fixed on the sky as if searching for mercy there. Tradition holds that pressed beneath that heap, Giles Corey spoke a single, almost defiant phrase. More weight, as though meeting cruelty with a bleak resolve. Whether every syllable of that moment is recorded exactly as it happened, the image survives. A man deliberately crushed, a legal cruelty made physically real, and a family left to carry the aftermath. Crushing could be sudden or judicial. It might be a single catastrophic impact, a collapsed wall, a falling beam, or it could be a measured imposition of force designed to stretch suffering over hours or days, turning the body into a ledger on which power was tallied. Another man, John Darren Camo, met his end the same way. Whether the stones fell by accident or by design, the method's finality is the same. The particulars of place and time change, but the human reality does not. The air grows shallow, muscles fail, and the mind begins to distance itself from pain, even as the world narrows to the weight that will not be lifted. To picture these deaths is to confront a raw, elemental brutality that leaves no neat explanations, only the memory of weight pressing down until the last breath is taken. It is a reminder that the mechanics of death can be painfully simple: stone on chest, gravity and law converging, and that history keeps the names of those who lay beneath that weight, so we might not forget how compassion can be overwhelmed by custom, fear, or calculated force. Beneath the heavy weight of royal law, in the long, dim era we call the Ancien Regime, treason was treated not as a private crime, but as an assault on the body of the realm itself. And the punishment was meant to answer that assault with terrible clarity. Dismemberment, both brutal and ceremonial, unfolded where the town met the world, on cobbled squares before the councils, under the church's shadow. Townsfolk and nobility alike gathered, a crowd that hummed with curiosity and dread. Priests prayed at the edge of the square, their voices thin against the wind. Officials read the verdict in measured tones, the inked script carrying the law into plain daylight. And the executioner, a figure at once feared and necessary, carried out his grim task with practiced motion. The scene was arranged like a lesson, the slow, clinical removal of limbs, the choreography of shame and order, all staged to warn and to dehumanize the act that had divided the Commonwealth. By tearing limb from limb, the state made the rupture visible, and in that violent repair declared its power to mend the world by force. This practice did not belong to a single throne. At various times across distant courts and republican assemblies, other nations resorted to similarly severe corporeal punishments for the gravest political crimes, each shaping the ritual to fit its own laws and symbols. Wherever such sentences were carried out, the elements were the same: a hush that slid between reverence and revulsion, the condemned standing at the center of a moment that would be remembered, and the hard certainty that loyalty to sovereign or state was enforced not only by proclamations and fines, but, at the far edge of authority, by the ultimate dismembering of those who threatened the community's integrity. Long before the clatter of modern courts and the flicker of electric lights, people turned to an older, quieter judge: the water itself. Drowning appears in the earliest records, not as a single custom, but as something many different societies arrived at on their own, across oceans and mountains, in villages and cities, in communities with very different names for law and honor. It was chosen for many reasons: punishment for transgressions real or supposed, a ritual enacted by authorities who believed the waters could cleanse, contain, or absolve. Picture the hush on a riverbank, the low murmur of a gathered crowd, the thin, trembling line where land gives itself to current. A condemned figure, doubtful, defiant, resigned, is led to the edge. Sunlight might glint off the surface, birds could still call above, while hands tie ropes or lower a frail body into cold shallows. Some were eased in gently, others were bound and forced below until breath failed. The water did the work, swallowing the sound, dimming the last sight, leaving only slow eddies and the stunned memory of what had been. Those who carried out these acts wore the weight of community judgment, not just the cold mechanics of law, but the human need for order and explanation. To onlookers, it could appear as justice, ritual punishment, sacrifice, or bare survival. Through all of that, the water stayed the same, indifferent, ancient, continuous, a quiet presence that outlasted sorrow and the hard choices societies made about guilt, shame, and punishment. When a man was accused of the gravest offense against the realm, high treason, the law answered with a punishment meant to be unmistakable in its cruelty and its purpose. It was not simply a penalty for a crime. It was a message carved out in public to anyone who might imagine challenging the sovereign and the order of the state. In England, that message had a blunt name: drawing and quartering. Picture a market square on a raw morning, the stalls still damp, the smell of wet wool and hearth smoke hanging in the air, coins and gossip passing from hand to hand as the town gathers. At the center, a scaffold had been built. Ropes hung, platforms creaked, and officials in sober coats stood like punctuation against the gray sky. The condemned man was brought forward, gaunt, resolute, or quietly undone, his passage forced through the press of people. He had not been convicted of a private wrong, but of betraying the compact that bound ruler and ruled. And because of that, his fate was to be public, ritualized, and final. Drawing carried two old meanings, and both haunted the ritual. First, the condemned would be literally drawn to the place of execution, dragged along the streets, tied to a hurdle or to a horse, the procession itself part of the sentence. That slow, humiliating passage from the life of a free man into public unmaking was meant to announce the verdict in the most visible way. Later, the word took on a second, darker meaning. The act at the scaffold when the body was opened and the internal organs removed. A deliberate undoing intended to make the betrayal visible and to symbolize the corruption of loyalty. Then came the hanging. The rope did not always serve the merciful purpose we now associate with it. In many cases, the criminal was cut down while still alive, left gasping and conscious so that further punishment could be carried out. These were not random acts of cruelty, but ceremonial motions, the executioner's measured steps, a clergyman offering a prayer or counsel, officials ensuring the sentence was observed to the letter. After the hanging and the disemboweling, the final indignities followed, beheading and the division of the body into 4 parts. The head might be held up as an emblem of the conquered traitor, the quarters sent to gates, bridges, or busy roads, displayed to keep the memory of the crime and its fate alive long after the flesh had gone. Listen to the textures of the scene, murmurs rising and falling like a tide, the sharp commands of officers cutting through the crowd, the creak of ropes, and the occasional choke of a bystander's gasp, the soft clink of metal, and the low murmur of a prayer. For those who watched, the spectacle was at once terrifying and arrestingly ordinary, folded into the rhythms of a society that believed the visibility of punishment was essential to maintaining order. For families and friends, the public ritual was a final insult, a deliberate erasure of the person they had known. For the condemned, it was a last stage on which to offer apology or defiance, a place where personal fate met civic theater. As years passed, however, tastes in law and conscience began to shift. What had once been accepted as a form of state justice, a ritual meant to purify treason through sad and savage means, grew harder to reconcile with new ideas about humanity and the purpose of punishment. The images of heads and quarters fastened to bridges, the slow humiliations of the process, began to feel increasingly alien to changing sensibilities. Where once the sight was intended to instruct and deter, it started to jar with a growing sense that cruelty had no rightful place in the administration of justice. When the practice finally dropped out of law and away from the squares where it had been enacted, it left a stark lesson. The instruments a state chooses to enforce its rule reveal as much about its values as its laws do. Drawing and quartering remains a grim emblem of a past in which law and spectacle were braided together. Its memory is a reminder of how power once sought to secure itself through fear and display, and of how societies eventually changed the ways they recognize both crime and humanity. On hills and roads and in the shadow of city walls, some ways of killing were meant to do more than end a life. They were designed to speak. To parade a body in public was to turn death into a story that would haunt the living, a lesson hammered home with wood, iron, mortar, or simply with time and weather. Standing beside these practices is not just a matter of cataloging. It is listening to the dry rattle of a chain, the creak of timber, the soft, stubborn rattle of breath against iron. It is hearing how a life is taken not in a single clean stroke, but by exposure, neglect, and display. Start with exposure. The words feel clinical: starvation, dehydration, hypothermia, but the lived reality is anything but. Picture a figure shrinking under an indifferent sky, hunger gnawing until the stomach folds inward like a map left out in the rain. Thirst claws at the mouth, making the tongue papery and the throat a hollow tunnel. Days stretch thin. Light becomes an instrument of torment, not warmth, a constant, unblinking ledger of time passing. When night comes, the cold arrives like accusation, seeping through rags to steal heat from bone and muscle. Hypothermia blunts pain and then slows everything down. Starvation thins the body until it is a ledger of loss. Dehydration twists the organs and makes thought brittle. Minds drift between fevered dreams and sharp, unbearable clarity. Exposure kills by attrition, by eroding the small, stubborn engines that keep a body going until they fail. Passers-by may look away or linger to whisper. The sight is meant to warn and to fix a story in the mind of the community. Crucifixion takes that theater of death and raises it on a stage for all to see. The image is familiar and luminous, a man exhausted on a hill, the sky indifferent above him. But the method itself is a clear, deliberate cruelty that stretches across time. A tree or a cross becomes a platform for punishment and demonstration. Victims were bound or nailed to rough, splintered wood, the nails biting into skin and muscle, the body forced into an unnatural, permanent stretch. Breathing turns into a geometric torment. Each inhale requires muscles already collapsed by gravity. Each exhale feels like surrender. Wounds blacken and swell. Rust and sweat mingle on skin. Flies circle and settle as if keeping time. Onlookers gather by design, some there to see the law enforced, others moved by a brutal curiosity. Children pressed against a parent's hand, merchants who fold the spectacle into the day's commerce. Everyone becomes part of the scene. The display is deliberate. The body is not removed but left to teach until death finishes the sentence, and sometimes even beyond, when scavengers come or decay becomes part of the lesson. Nearby in that grim lexicon is gibbeting, which turns a dead or dying body into a signpost. Picture a high exposed beam from which an iron cage hangs, bars clinking softly in the wind. After execution, some victims were placed into those cages and left on gallows where travelers passed. A gibbeted body speaks a different language from a crucified one. Often the corpse itself remains, rigid and bloated, refuses the finality of burial, and forces the living to confront what law can do. Carrion birds learn the route. Slow rot takes hold. Odor becomes a herald that announces the road's new lesson. Where once travelers brought news and goods, they now encounter a stench meant to deter and instruct. The cruelty is theatrical and calculated. The body becomes an object lesson, an arresting, persistent proclamation of consequence. Even more intimate is immurement, a punishment that confines not to open air, but to stone and silence. To immure someone is to wall them in, sealing a person inside a space that denies freedom and the comforts of community. Sometimes used as a kind of life sentence, the walled-in person might be fed through a small aperture, existence reduced to a breath trapped behind mortar. More often, it is imagined as a final claustrophobic stopping point. The sound of mortar being applied, the last light sliding away, a private chamber shut from the world. The mind in such a place recalibrates. Panic's sharp edges give way to a grinding routine of listening, to the drip of water, to distant voices, to the slow crumble of sanity. If the sealed person is fed, life becomes a slow mechanical endurance. If not, the trapped body withers, and the narrow aperture for air and water becomes a cruel, constant reminder of the world going on outside. Immurement turns architecture into weaponry. The wall itself becomes both sentence and monument. Across these practices, exposure, crucifixion, gibbeting, immurement, there is a common note. It is not merely the taking of life, but the shaping of that death into something that will reach others. Punishment becomes pedagogy. The body becomes a text read by all who pass. Sky, road, scaffold, wall, all are co-conspirators, pieces of scenery chosen to amplify a single message. Obey, or your ending will be shown to the world. Each method carries its own particular torments: the slow erosion of wind and thirst, the geometric cruelty of a body hung upon wood, the humiliating permanence of a corpse on display, the claustrophobic erasure behind stone, and each forces witnesses into an uneasy transaction of memory, shame, warning, and the prurient curiosity that binds communities to their own rules. To listen to these stories is to feel the weight of history's harshest choices. They are not mere footnotes. They map where law collided with spectacle and where cruelty met control. The details, the rasp of rope, the bite of iron, the sound of mortar, linger because these punishments were meant to leave a mark you could not unsee. As with that one luminous image of a man on a hill, retold across centuries, each method remains a vivid, terrible testimony. This is how a society taught its people the price of transgression, and this is how it made sure, with wood and stone and open sky, that the lesson would not soon be forgotten. There is a cruelty that has always lived in the simplest motion, the instant a body parts from the world and begins to fall. Once that cruelty found a name and a place, a yawning hollow carved into the earth beside the heartbeat of a city. The Barathron in Athens was not just a pit, it was a final geography, a cut in the horizon where law and public wrath met. Picture the white stone of the city, its steps and temples bright with sun, and then imagine that civic brightness suddenly interrupted by a dark, gaping mouth. Into that mouth, the condemned were led not by accident, but by choice. Among them were men once entrusted with command, Athenian generals judged for their part in the Battle of Arginusai. Leaders turned to a single terrible act. They were cast into the hollow. Their descent was a blunt, irrevocable punctuation to politics, grief, and anger. After the throw, there was a hush, the echo of robes down the shaft, a stone striking stone, the city resuming its daily rhythms while a silence collected at the bottom of the pit like dust. Far across time and space, the same cruel logic took a different shape. During Argentina's dirty war, people were seized in the night, taken in secret from homes, from streets, from whatever ordinary life they had known, and placed into a modern choreography of disappearance. Drugged so they could not resist, they were loaded into planes and carried out over the indifferent expanse of ocean. At altitude, guards opened doors and let them go. The roar of engines swallowed any sound. The machinery of state and secrecy replaced the theater of the police, and the sky itself became an accomplice. The water closed over them. Names and faces were swallowed in the dark, the sea keeping a cold, absolute silence and giving nothing back. The tools changed. The Barathrons carved stone, and the plane's metal hull. But the human cost did not. In Athens, the fall was public law made visible. In Argentina, it was clandestine terror made invisible. Both were deliberate handovers of bodies to the open air and the force of descent, a finality enacted by institutions entrusted with power. To picture these rites is to feel that awful arc of falling, to hear the brief final noises and then the long settling hush. It is a reminder of how easily a society can turn its instruments, ancient stone or modern metal, into theaters of disappearance, and how the physics of a fall can become the language of erasure. Flaying. The word hits like a cold fact, the removal of the entire skin. But that dry definition doesn't capture what the act could mean in human hands. It could be law or terror, ritual or proclamation, an operation that tore away the border between inside and out and left a person unmade. Across the centuries, flaying belonged to the darkest side of punishment. In some courts and on some battlefields, it was not recorded as mere cruelty, but as statement. Rulers boasted of it in proclamations. Commanders used it to silence revolts. Communities learned to read it as a final, unmistakable lesson in power. There are blunt, terrible mentions on monuments and in inscriptions, Enemies flayed, skins removed and sometimes displayed, lines meant to make a reader shiver and remember who held authority. Imagine the scene as theater. A city square or a palace courtyard becomes a stage where punishment is staged to impress and intimidate. Torches gutter in the dusk, a hush settles over the crowd, soldiers form a rigid frame around the act. Those close enough breathe a mix of cold metal and sweat. Those at the edges feel the prickling dread that draws a crowd inward, leaning to see and holding their breath as if sight alone could fix the meaning of the deed. That sting comes not only from pain, but from the symbolic weight of skin itself. Skin is more than tissue. It's a border and a name, the visible claim a person makes on the world. To strip it away is to say the condemned is not simply guilty, but erased, a public denial of humanity. For rulers who needed obedience and for generals who wanted to warn enemies, nothing could announce authority more emphatically. The sources that reach us are often terse and deliberate. Edicts, boasts, carved scenes on stone. These records speak with the blunt economy of someone determined to lodge a message in memory. The starkness of these lines is part of their power. A short sentence about flaying can be meant to echo across generations, a piece of statecraft rendered in the harshest possible terms. But the story never lives only in monuments. Behind every curt record are terrified faces, broken households, communities that learn to read a brutal lesson into the shape of everyday life. Families who watched or who received the news had to rearrange their lives around the warning. Rituals of justice and of revenge left marks not just on the bodies of the punished, but on the social landscape, scars that lingered in speech, gesture, and the way people avoided certain streets or certain names. Flaying thus occupies a grim margin where law and terror cross. It could be wielded as official punishment, as a theatrical tool to enforce decrees, or as personal vengeance carved into flesh. In every case, it was both instrument and symbol, a physical act that doubled as a message, meant to be understood by many as well as to punish one. To talk about flaying is to hold both the cold precision of the term and the long human shadow it cast. Picture the crowd leaning in, the certainty-seeking voice of power, the abrupt humiliation of a person reduced to spectacle. It reminds us that, in parts of our past, punishment did more than end a life or inflict suffering. It aimed to make annihilation legible, a warning carved into human flesh so an entire city might read it and remember. Picture a rough-hewn stake driven upright into sun-baked earth, its splintered point catching dust and the long shadow of a gathered crowd. There is no music, no celebration, only a hush threaded with a distant murmur, the scrape of sandals, the soft hush of those who have come to watch a deliberate public infliction of pain. This is the grim instrument of impalement, a pole, a spear, a sharpened tree trunk meant to penetrate the human body, a punishment and a warning carved into the landscape so everyone can see it. Impalement took many forms across time and place, but the essential brutality never changed. Sometimes the stake pierced only part way, tearing muscle and skin without passing clean through the torso. Other times the body was skewered more fully, a limb or the trunk impaled and fastened, so the condemned could be raised for display or left to slump. Often a body was held aloft so travelers and caravans, merchants and neighbors could not miss the message. Sometimes victims were left on the ground, pinned and exposed to weather, to scavengers, and to the slow collapse of strength that comes with pain and thirst. There was a method to this cruelty. Impalement was theater and it was law. Rulers and commanders used it to punish crimes, to deter rebellion, to single out enemies, to make power legible in the harshest terms. Ancient chronicles and archaeological traces place it across the Near East, in parts of the medieval Islamic world, and later in the volatile borderlands of Eastern Europe. The method adapted to circumstance, stakes planted along roadways as warnings, hooks and poles used in sieges to terrify and clear defenders, a single body left like a grotesque signpost, and every variation spoke the same blunt truth. Defiance will be answered with something visible and unforgettable. Contemporary witnesses left chilling impressions that survive in writing and memory. Observers describe dignity stripped to the bare mechanics of survival, faces drained of color, eyes clouded by fever, breath growing thin beneath an unforgiving sun. Death, when it came, was seldom quick. Shock, infection, exposure, and the constant punishing weight on torn flesh stretched suffering into an ordeal measured in hours or days. For those who ordered such punishments, the spectacle combined cold practicality with ritual. The body became at once penalty and proclamation, a lesson taught in flesh. Even now, the image of impalement holds a particular force. It reminds us that justice and tyranny have often been decided in public, that rulers once sought to settle disputes with visible horror meant to instruct and intimidate. The stakes left behind in records and ruins are mute testimony to how raw fear was shaped into policy. To hear of impalement is to imagine the creak of wood, the hum of flies, the murmur of a crowd, and the terrible lesson hung there for anyone who might next consider crossing those in power. They lashed him out where everyone could see. On the wide, weather-darkened deck, the men formed a tight, silent ring, faces half hidden beneath oilskins and stinging spray. The captain's voice came small and hard, more command than sentence, and the ropes answered with a hollow wooden creak that seemed to belong to the ship herself. Keel-hauling was a punishment born of salt and the hard law of life at sea, a deliberate dragging of a man beneath the vessel pressed against the barnacled skin of the hull, an ordeal meant to shame, to wound, and above all to keep a fragile crew in order. They rigged the lines, running them from a block on one rail to another opposite it. The condemned man, stripped for the work, felt the cold bite of the wind and the rough rope at his wrists as he was lowered toward the black belly of the ship. For a long, suspended moment, there was only water and shadow. The world narrowed to the metallic tang of salt on his tongue and the rasp of timber against skin. Barnacles and encrusted growth clung to the hull like crusted teeth. As his body slid past, they ripped at skin and muscle with a grinding, tearing sound that mixed cruelly with the rush of the sea. Keel-hauling was not usually intended to be a sentence of death. Its purpose was blunt and public, to inflict pain and humiliation, to serve as an example to a crew that had to hold together through storms, rationing, and the ever-present fear of mutiny. Still, the sea is indifferent. The same scraping that carved a map across flesh could leave men drowned, or set into festering infections, or carry them into slow, lingering deaths once the ship reached harbor, and care was rudimentary at best. Around him the sailors stood quiet, some with eyes averted, others watching with a brittle mix of sympathy and relief. The punishment done, the fragile order of the voyage reasserted. When the ropes hauled him back up, his skin was a raw map of the keel's contours, salt crusting the open wounds. He lay on the planks, chest heaving, breath coming in ragged, shocked pulls. For everyone who watched, he became a living reminder of why such measures had been born among seafarers, harsh and terrifying, yet woven into the rhythm of life on wooden ships that plied storm and trade across cold, open water. Mazzatello. The word hits the ear the way the weapon strikes the skull, blunt, uncompromising. It names a method of execution built on the simplest, most brutal elements, a length of wood or iron, a leather grip slick with sweat, and the weight of a man's arm bringing it down. Picture a soldier holding that heavy instrument, feeling its mass in his forearm, the sun sharp on his back, the mallet's shadow cutting a dark line across the ground. It is as old as the idea that force can answer guilt, wood against bone, impact resolving verdict. There is no ceremony to the act, only a terse economy of movement. The condemned are brought forward with wrists bound, their faces registering defiance, resignation, or the peculiar small hope that something will change. The executioner takes his place, not garbed in pageantry, but in the plainness of a uniform or a rough coat, perhaps with a hood, hands steady from practice. He sets his shoulders, measures the distance, and the crowd inhales as one. The ordinary sounds of life, boots on packed earth, a murmur, fall away until you can hear the small, intimate noises. A fly beating at sunlit stone, the rasp of fabric, a man's throat working. The strike is brief and final, an ugly, concussive note like a bell gone wrong. Flesh and bone obey the force. The skull gives with a sickening fracture, collapsing on itself. The body answers the blow in split seconds, sometimes folding forward as if released from command, sometimes slumping backward, knees buckling. Death can be mercifully immediate, a single catastrophic impact that ends everything at once. Just as often, the cruelty of blunt force lingers, the condemned staggering between consciousness and oblivion, eyes glazing as pain and panic race through a damaged mind. Blood darkens clothing and soil, and the air takes on the iron scent that follows such violence, mingled with fear. The world feels smaller in those moments, focused down to the rhythm of breath and the sudden absence of it. Whether the ending is quick or prolonged, the scene leaves a mark, not only on the body but on the witnesses who stand and watch, on the men who carry out the sentence, and on whatever thin order it was meant to enforce. Mazzatello speaks in a language everyone understands because it strips away rhetoric and shows results. Silence where voice used to be, stillness where motion had been. It is a kind of justice reduced to a physical punctuation mark. Plain, brutal, unforgettable. Long after the crowd disperses, the memory lingers of that heavy mallet raised and dropped, the image echoing in the bones of those who saw it, a terrible shorthand for the power that decided life and death. In the hush of palace corridors, where lacquered screens kept the light soft and the footsteps softer, death could be dressed in propriety. In the long, strict century of the Joseon dynasty, there was a sanctioned way to end the life of a man of rank, sayak, the bestowed medicine. When the condemned belonged to the yangban, the noble, educated elite, or to the royal family, the state refused the spectacle of a public beheading. That refusal was not mere mercy, but a moral code. Confucian order insisted that a true gentleman, a seonbi, might be killed but must not be shamed, saga salbulga yok, shike sha buke ru. To humiliate a man of learning was a wrong the state would not commit, even in punishment. So the poison came as a medicine, administered with the grim courtesy of a court that prized ritual above drama. Attendants moved like shadows in silk, soft-soled shoes making no sound. Officials kept their faces controlled, their words clipped to the formal lines of duty. A lacquered bowl was set before the condemned, hands steady, masks of duty hiding whatever sorrow or relief might trouble them. The man was allowed to swallow in private dignity, to meet the end in the posture he had kept in life, composed, obedient to rank and ritual. There were no jeers, no mobs, no breach of decorum, only the quiet, fatal choreography of a society that believed honor could be preserved, even as a body was taken. Far to the west, sunlight fell differently in the courtyards of ancient Greece, but it touched a similar impulse. Execution by hemlock, the bitter, slowly working poison drawn from a simple herb, became a solemn instrument of justice. The most famous cup belongs to Socrates. Condemned by an Athenian jury, he drank the hemlock not in panic, but with a calm that matched his life of questioning. Friends and followers stayed close. Accounts tell of him continuing calm conversation as the numbness crept upward, as sensation faded in stages. Hemlock granted time, enough for reason to linger, for thought to fade into quiet acceptance rather than sudden convulsion. The ending, like the trial, remained a lesson. In both places, the method of death was not merely practical, but symbolic. Whether by the discreet dosing of Syac in the Joseon court or the measured cup of hemlock in classical Athens, these final acts were shaped by the values that governed life: honor, restraint, and a belief that even in punishment a certain dignity could be preserved. Poison in these hands was not only an end but a last ceremony, an expression of a culture that made the close of a life conform to its ideals. There is a hush that falls before a terrible sentence, a stillness held like a breath in a crowded room. Instruments gleam under cold light, and people hold that breath as if it might steady what comes next. The punishment known simply as sawing is brutal in its clarity. The condemned is laid out. The task is literal and unsparing. Skilled hands take up a heavy saw, and a precise, almost clinical intent turns the ritual of execution into an act of division. Sometimes the blade travels down the center of the body, following the midline so the person is split left from right, a sagittal cut, often mid-sagittal, severing the figure into two mirror halves. At other times, the cut runs across the torso, a transverse division that separates upper from lower. There is no metaphor here, only method. Two principal ways to render a body into pieces, each as final as the other. Picture the scene without embellishment: the weight of the air, the metallic scent, the first rasp of the saw as it bites into whatever it meets. The sound is a grinding, mechanical cadence, a rhythm repeated until the work is done. There is no subtlety in the movement. It is designed to be definitive. For the condemned, that moment brings an unbearable clarity, a sudden, painful awareness of borders and of the body reduced to a landscape to be measured and divided. For those who witness it, the sight is a harsh lesson in power and consequence, a spectacle that arrests both eye and heart without flourish. The facts are simple and the intention unambiguous. The memory of such acts lingers like a stain. In the end, sawing stands as a grim reminder of how societies have tried to make final judgment manifest. Irreversible, physical, and brutally visible. Imagine a flat, stagnant pool on a hot day, reeds whispering at its edges and the air thick with the sour tang of rot. In the middle of that slow, unmoving water, two narrow wooden boats sit side by side, their keels forming a crude cradle. Into that cradle, a condemned person is laid, not buried, not hung, but placed between those two hulls so that their body is exposed to the humid, insect-rich atmosphere and the lazy motion of the pond, while dragonflies and the distant buzz of mosquitoes mark the passing hours. The ritual that follows is simple and terrible. The victim is force-fed a sweet, oily mixture of milk and honey until the belly swells and the body rebels. Those ingredients are chosen with cruel calculation. Milk and honey, foods that comfort or preserve in other settings, become here the instruments of a slow undoing. The boats are kept where the water moves little and the air gathers warmth. Flies settle first. Then other insects are drawn in, answering the scent and the small, exposed openings of a body in decline. Fever rises. The mixture does its brutal work. Severe diarrhea begins and cannot be stopped. Private functions are turned into a public spectacle, and the excretions and softening skin become an invitation to the marsh's scavengers. Small creatures burrow and nest where the skin yields, where the warmth makes entry easy, and the slow gnawing damage spreads outward from those first intrusions. The pain is not sudden, but cumulative, a grinding erosion of strength and dignity over hours and days, until the human frame can no longer keep the invasion at bay. Death in this account is not delivered by a single stroke or a drop of poison, but by the collapse of the body's defenses into overwhelming infection. Sepsis, systemic and fatal, brings the long, terrible sequence to its end, a sequence that began with two boats, a sweet mixture, and a stagnant pond. Whether this exact method was ever widely practiced is debated among scholars. Its historicity remains disputed. When the moment came, everything in the room seemed to shrink to the size of a single terrible intention. Light moved slowly across woven tatami and plain paper walls, softening the edges of a chamber where ceremony had pushed ordinary life aside. The samurai who rose to perform seppuku carried himself with the same measured composure that had defined him. Slow breaths, steady shoulders, the unhurried dressing in white that marked both surrender and sanctity. He held a short blade, a tanto or wakizashi, small enough to be cradled at the ribs, yet sharp enough to turn inward motion into finality. Around him stood retainers, magistrates, neighbors. Some faces were rigid with protocol, others loosened with a sorrow that had no words. The only sounds were the rustle of cloth, the muted creak of floorboards, and the collective suspension of those who watched. Seppuku was a ritual of suffering braided with dignity. It required the practitioner to disembowel himself, a violent, intimate motion that acted as both punishment and statement. The act spoke in a language of blood and resolve, an answer to shame offered by the body when words would not suffice. Beside the man, often waiting in silent readiness, a kaishakunin stood with sword in hand, a trusted friend or appointed executioner charged with the mercy stroke. When the blade had done its terrible work and the samurai had demonstrated the depth of his resolve, the kaishakunin brought the sword down to spare prolonged agony, severing head from body in a single, precise cut. That final act, though brutal to behold, was not cruelty, but a ritual mercy, a last gift of release, and a way to restore some composure to the fallen warrior in death. When people imagine seppuku, they often think first of the voluntary kind, a samurai choosing death to preserve honor or to protest an unbearable injustice. Those stories linger because they speak plainly of agency and a final assertion of self. Yet for many who wore the top knot, seppuku was not a chosen crown, but an imposed sentence. Disgraced samurai, men who had failed, offended, or broken the rigid codes of their order, were sometimes ordered to die by their own hand. In those instances, the ritual became a form of capital punishment, a public erasure of status performed to uphold social order. The subtle cruelty lay in the similarity of the motions. Both paths ended in the same blood and steel, but one read as defiant acceptance and the other as a humiliation carried out beneath the weight of law and shame. Set against a larger world of duty and reputation, seppuku operated as the most severe answer to failure. It was the place where private conscience met public judgment and the unforgiving geometry of tradition. Whether entered willingly or forced by command, the act left behind a quiet wake of grief and a restored social balance. A life closed not with private sorrow, but by ritual clarity. In the hush that followed, the room returned to ordinary light, but the memory of that precise motion, the blade, the sacrifice, the mercy stroke, lingered like a shadow, a stark conclusion written in steel and ceremony. They led him out before dawn, when the city still clung to sleep and the lanterns threw long, wavering shadows across the square. A handful of officials stood like weathered stones, their robes folded into precise angles, silent as carved witnesses. Beyond them, the crowd waited. The hush of people gathered to see law made visible. The condemned moved through that quiet like a single fragile figure inside a vast machine, bound in cords, stripped of everything that marked him as husband, father, or man of rank, brought into a public place so that his fate would be recorded in memory as surely as on any official roll. What followed was not a single stroke, but a ritual stretched over time. Common speech named it death by 1,000 cuts, a slow, relentless orderliness that reduced a body piece by piece until breath left and the ceremony was complete. The sentence aimed to do more than end a life. It was designed to humiliate, to erase a person standing in the community, to punish descendants by denying the usual rites that honor the dead. To magistrates and to many in the crowd, it was an enactment of justice. The body itself became a ledger where the crime was paid. The executioner moved with a steady, unemotional precision, his actions part of the procedure rather than of a story. The crowd's response shifted with the moment. Muted curiosity, sudden eruptions, a grim, ritualized attention. Some watched with the cool interest of judges. Others came with malice or out of a sense of duty. For the person at the center of it, time rearranged itself. Hours could stretch into an interior eternity, leaving room for memory, of home, of small kindnesses, and for the mind to gather itself before the inevitable. Even amid the cruelty, moments of tenderness appeared. A relative's whispered prayer, an official's brief attention to a last wish, the condemned's quiet reconciliation with the life he had led. This form of punishment was not simply cruelty for cruelty's sake in the view of those who practiced it. It was woven into legal codes and public ceremony, reserved for the gravest offenses where the state wished to make an indelible example. To witness it was to be reminded of the social order the punishment upheld, and of the fearful stakes of violating it. Over generations, it carried the weight of law, morality, and spectacle all at once, an instrument meant as much for deterrence as for retribution. Slowly, inexorably, that appetite for spectacle shifted. Societies change, legal minds evolve, and practices once accepted as rightful came to be questioned on moral and humanitarian grounds. What had been written into law and performed in public was gradually seen as a relic of an older world. The ritual of slow slicing, intended to erase a person's place in the community, ultimately met its own erasure from formal legal practice, leaving behind only the memory of what happens when judgment is taken to its most literal and prolonged extreme. When we recall that history, we do not glorify its mechanics nor linger on grotesque detail. Instead, we listen to what such a ritual tells us about the societies that sanctioned it, how law and ceremony can entwine to inflict pain, how public shame can be wielded as a weapon, and how the human heart can both enact and endure suffering. The image that remains is not spectacle for its own sake, but a long, slow unraveling of a life, of a body used as a stage of judgment, and of the laws that once found such extreme measures necessary to hold a community together. It hangs in the center of the chamber like a perverse pendulum of time, a heavy axe head, its edge blackened and ready to bite, tethered by a rope or chain that lets it swing in slow, inexorable arcs. Torchlight, or a single guttering lamp, picks out the cold curve of the blade as it passes, and with every barely audible swing, it draws imperceptibly nearer to the prone figure beneath. This is not a sudden executioner's strike, but a patient, mechanical menace that measures terror by inches and minutes. The sound is not loud. It is a dull, metronomic thud and the soft whisper of chain on air, a rhythm that seems to make the stone walls breathe along with it. With each pass, the room seems to shrink, the gap between metal and flesh diminishing as if by conspiracy, until even stillness begins to feel like motion. Stories linger over the small cruelties, the blade's shadow cutting across a face, the way a candle flame trembles when the weight swings, the tiny beads of sweat forming along a jaw while hope learns to stop keeping time. You can almost feel the chill of the iron and the stale smell of oil and smoke. You can almost hear the slow, indifferent tick of some unseen clock. It is a machine that needs no hands to be cruel. Its very mechanism is the cruelty. Regular, inevitable, indifferent. Yet however vivid the descriptions, however carefully storytellers paint each stroke, historians and scholars have not agreed that such a device belongs to the recorded past. Its existence sits on uneasy ground between report and rumor, in the margins where invention and memory can look very like history. And still the image survives, powerful and troubling. A blade that measures out dread in slow arcs. A room of shadows and ticking, the quiet suspense of something that inches closer with mechanical patience. The question it leaves behind has an almost stubborn life of its own. Did this belong in the archives of the real or only in the darker reaches of imagination? Its historicity remains disputed.